And I'm so sorry. And for being an amazing friend to booksellers everywhere, Dean. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And for being for providing brilliant instruction to all his students over the years. I've had so many of your students in the store, and they really respect and admire what the gifts you've given them through education. And ultimately for being one astounding writer and storyteller. The format of the evening, and we can go a little over because of my late start. Once again, I apologize. But after I formally introduce the panelists with an official biography, Charlotte and Dean will engage in a conversation for about 35 minutes. After that, there'll be a period of question and answers. And then at the top of the hour or a little over, I will say my goodbyes. But I'd also like to say that anybody who puts a question in the chat box, we will choose at random one of you who have asked a question for tonight's event, and we will be sending you or arrange a pickup wherever you are for a free copy of Dean's book. So we have a lot to cover, so I'll just get into the official bios. First off, Charlotte Gray, our moderator. Charlotte Gray is the author of 11 nonfiction bestsellers about Canadian politics, history, and personalities. 2 of these books were true crime stories because, like Dean, she finds criminal activities and trials an irresistible way of portraying the larger society in which the crime occurs. A member of the Order of Canada and an adjunct professor at Carleton University, she recently received the prestigious Scholars Award from the Library and Archives Foundation. She lives in Ottawa and plays a mean game of tennis when the lockdown will allow. And our main guest tonight, the author of tonight's book, The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, Dean Jobb, is the author as well of Empire of Deception, and I'll try to do this. There's Dean's incredible first book, a true bestseller in our store. The book is a story of 1920 Chicago con man and his escape to a new life in Nova Scotia. It won the Crime Writers of Canada Award for Best True Crime Book, was a finalist for the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize, and was named the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year. No small feats. Dean is also the author of 2 collections of crime stories from Nova Scotia's past, Daring, Devious, and Deadly, a local bestseller in 2020, and a sequel, Madness, Mayhem, and Murder, coming this fall from Pottersfield Press. He writes a monthly true crime column for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and his work has appeared in Crime Reads, the Irish Times, and the Globe and Mail. He teaches in the Master of Fine Arts and Creative Nonfiction program at the University of King's College. So thank you, Dean, and thank you, Charlotte. And once again, I'll be back afterwards, and I'll just let everybody know once again that anybody who registered through email will be getting a link to a recording of this event. So off we go.
Thank you, Mike, for that very nice introduction. You did a lot better than me when I was sort of stuttering through to make sure there wasn't any dead air. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'd love to welcome everybody who has joined us. It's a change of pace for all of us authors to do Zooms, and we're getting used to it. But there's always that sort of heart in the mouth technical moment at the beginning. We're through that. I'm going to plunge straight into questions and answers with Dean. And after I've had my go of asking what I really want to know about the book, I'm going to suggest he does a short reading, after which we're going to take questions from the audience, which you can put. Mike actually did mention putting them in the chat. I'd probably find them easier in the Q&A, which is on the bottom right-hand side of the toolbar for Zoom. But I'll keep an eye on both, but keep thinking of those questions that you'd like to ask, because this is a fabulous book, a really extraordinary book. And Dean has already, I've read a couple of pieces that he's, when he's been interviewed, and he has such interesting things to say about it. So Dean, first of all, why don't you start by just telling us, how did you discover this story?
Well, I'm always on the hunt for true crime stories, and the Victorian era is a fertile hunting ground, I guess. Cream is one of these sinister, shadowy figures who pops up, and his story is just so compelling. I mean, here's a man who somehow managed to murder in 3 countries over a span of 15 years, and claiming as many as 10 victims. And I was just captivated by the idea, how could this be? How could this have happened? And the more I looked at it, I thought, this is a story that, as you said, Charlotte, has that the feature of opening a window on the past to trying to understand how we got away with these crimes says a lot about the Victorian era.
So just give us a quick overview of this story, because it's, as you said, it's on 3 continents, which in itself, at the time that he was carrying out all these horrendous murders, just switching between continents was not back then, it was almost like COVID. Nobody was flying between continents.
Well, but over this career of murder, Thomas Neal Cream traveled a long way. He was born in Quebec City. His father was a wealthy timber merchant. All of the advantages of growing up in a well-off family, sent to medical school at McGill and graduated in class of 1876. And from that point on, started using his medical knowledge to kill. He married young because he got his girlfriend pregnant in Waterloo, Quebec, near Montreal. Within a year, she was dead. He went to London, Ontario, opened a medical practice, and within a year, one of his female patients was found dead in circumstances that she'd been poisoned with chloroform that looked like murder, and Cream became the prime suspect. But despite the evidence and suspicion, he was never charged and was able to skip town, set up practice in Chicago. Within about a year and a half, 3 more women are dead, patients of his. He's specializing as an abortionist at a time when abortion was illegal and very hard to get. So his victims were coming to him. He finally ends up going to prison for a life term for his 6th murder, serves a prison term, but manages to get that commuted. And in 1891, 1892, he continued this rampage in London and killed 4 more women before he was ultimately caught.
I was interested in the way you'd constructed this story, because as you've just told us, the story of his life begins in Quebec City, where he was born, the son of an Irish immigrant and a successful businessman. But you chose to begin in London. Why was that?
Well, actually, the book opens in London. There's a prologue with him getting out of prison. And that, of course, is the prelude to his then heading to London, where he goes on his final rampage. And I think that was what interested me, because I wanted this to be the story not of his litany of murders alone, but of the hunt. And that's when the hunt for Thomas Neal Cream really begins. He eventually becomes Scotland Yard's chief suspect. And at that point, they want to know more about his past. There's a bit of things in the newspaper about trials and allegations against him in the past. So they send an inspector named Frederick Jarvis to the New World, to Canada and the United States, to trace his path and his past crimes. So that, I thought, as a storytelling method, just became, I could tell his backstory in real time as it was happening, but with the thread of what this inspector was discovering at various points as he went to Montreal, went to Chicago, went to other places.
And of course, that's the difference, one of the many differences between true crime and a crime thriller. True crime, in fact, you pretty well know who the murderer is from the start, because usually you know because it's been a big story in the newspapers. And so, in fact, as you said, it is the hunt and slowly putting the pieces together that's just the fascination for the reader.
These are howdonits, really.
Yeah, how done.
It's extremely difficult to pull an Agatha Christie and then bring all the suspects into a room at the end and unravel it for the audience. Yeah, it's rare, but it can be done. But in this case, the whole point of the book is this is one of the early serial killers at a time when the term didn't exist, which is part of the reason he got away with it. Police forces, the public, that nobody really understood that this kind of monster existed. And of course, in our day, they're all too common. But at that time, this was, you see it in the press, head scratching. You know, how could someone kill for the sake of murder?
So why did he keep killing? I mean, he started off, you know, the early reports of his early life, he sounds like a very impressive young man who goes off to McGill to study medicine. People don't have anything bad to say about him. Why does he kill and kill again?
Well, I mean, as an historian, when you go back, I mean, one of his people who knew him as a youth said, you know, he's a bright young man destined to make his mark on the world. I mean, what could be more prophetic in the wrong way than that? Because he did. Something snapped, I guess, for want of a better word. His medical training, he could have been godlike and saved people, which is how one of his professors put it, the role of the doctor. He seemed to be more interested in playing God. Many people crossed paths with him over the years. It looks like there were only 10 people he murdered, but along the way, he was picking and choosing who would live and who would die. He was dispensing medicine, and sometimes he'd put a fatal dose of strychnine in. So a very sick psychology.
And the kind of sort of wanting power over human life. And
yeah, and godlike in the sense of killing from afar. Poison was his weapon of choice. By the time he went to London, he'd perfected how to get someone to take strychnine, which is so bitter nobody would take a fatal dose. He would put it in a gelatin capsule, which was a fairly new innovation for taking medicine at the time. And he would tell his victims, you know, this will help you. He's passing it off as medicine. Take one before bed when he's safely out of the picture, so he can escape. He can kill from afar, which again is the power he must have felt he had.
Dean, what was it like spending, I don't know how long the book took, but obviously a long time, spending so long with such a despicable character? Because usually as an author, you want to get inside the character and discover some kind of way of understanding him, and inevitably some element of not empathy exactly, but sympathy usually creeps in. How did you find it to spend all this time with him?
Well, fortunately, I got to spend a lot of time with Scotland Yard detectives, which was a nice sort of counterpoint. Well, in the sense, I found him such a fascinating character, and what I wanted to do for readers as best as you can, but being true to the facts, is try to understand how this monster was made. Was there something in his upbringing? Hard to say. His mother died when he was still fairly young. By all accounts, that had a devastating effect on him. I don't think that turns him into a serial poisoner who hates women. He goes to medical school at a time when medicine is crude, when surgery is done without anesthetic or sterilized instruments. That didn't necessarily make him a killer. But maybe all of this together somehow morphs into something. And he certainly used his knowledge of medicine. One of the interesting things was that I found is his final murders in 1890s London are happening when Sherlock Holmes is bursting on the scene as a character in the Strand magazine. And Arthur Conan Doyle, in one of the stories that appeared in the midst of Cream's poisonings, has a character say, Sherlock Holmes says that a doctor is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. And that really applies to Cream. His medical training gave him nerve and knowledge, and it also put him above suspicion. I would see in the records, people would think, well, yeah, but he's the doctor. He can't be the killer. Well, he was.
One of the things that really comes through in the book is how the issue of how little people often seem to care for his victims. And I was thinking more generally, you know, what does this story tell us about the life and attitudes in the Victorian era?
I wanted to explore that because part of how he got away with it was the role of women in Victorian society. First of all, that a pregnancy out of wedlock being described as a living death. This meant that women were desperate for help, desperate for abortions. And here was someone who would do it and possibly kill them for kicks, I guess. So his victims were coming to him. He didn't even have to stalk the streets for them. They were coming because they trusted him, and he betrayed that. So he's preying on women who have nowhere else to turn. But I also saw attitudes even among the police. They talked about how unreliable the prostitutes of Lambeth and London area that he was preying on, and they wouldn't cooperate. Well, of course, they feared the police feared being rounded up. So he was preying on vulnerable people who had nowhere else to turn. And again, at the time, perhaps limited far too little police protection.
And I mean, the combination of sort of the disdain for women and sense that their lives were not that valuable, with what you said earlier, which was the really exaggerated respect for professional men. That, you know, how could a doctor murder? I mean, I thought it was a brilliant detail that you found from that Sherlock Holmes story where he does say, everybody trusts the doctor. And that was, of course, a device that Agatha Christie, to return to her again, and other detective novelists have used several times. The doctor is above suspicion. Well, he's not.
There's a really telling comment that one of his victims, as she lay dying, and strychnine is a horrible poison, lingering, painful, grotesque death. But one of his victims was explaining that she had taken a pill from this man who she only had a first name for, and it was an alias that Cream had made up. And someone said, well, why would you do that? Why would you take a pill from a stranger? And her line was, he wasn't a stranger, he was a doctor. And I thought, well, that said it all, you know, and the way Cream, time after time, betrayed the trust of his victims that was put in him as a medical man, and then was able to use that as a shield to avoid suspicion. Yeah, you said, how did I like hanging out with him? Well, I think what I liked most was exposing him.
Now, the research that you did on the life of Dr. Cream was itself phenomenal, just sort of tracking him. But I mean, there, in fact, you had a guide who'd gone before you, the Scotland Yard detective. You had the case notes there. Just incidentally, before I finish my question, how many boxes in the archives were just the Scotland Yard reports?
I'm trying to remember now because it's been a few years, but they tend, well, I would say it would stack up. Yeah, it's you know, a couple of feet thick, I think.
But I mean, just that is quite a brick to get through. But what I really admire about your book is the contextual detail and the research that you did on that. I mean, I learned about the Quebec lumber trade, the development of forensic medicine and discovery of poisons, the medical education at McGill, the rise of detective thrillers. I mean, how many different archives did you go to?
Well, when I set out, I like to go to the places I'm writing about wherever possible. That's why this pandemic is so frustrating. I know, Charlotte, you've had some trips curtailed as well. So I went to London. I wanted to walk the streets that he had walked. I wanted to see the neighborhood, what was left of it that he would have seen. And then there are vestiges. And I used the archives there, and there are several archives in the British Library and others. Went to Quebec City. Found archival material in his church, his former church in Quebec City. The McGill archives, the local archives in Waterloo, Quebec. These were all troves of not just material on Cream, but of the places, of the times. And I went to Chicago, and one of the things I set out to do was, I could tell from earlier books and articles that had been done that there were certain things that had never been looked at. For instance, I knew there'd be an autopsy report and or an inquest transcript from the murder in London, Ontario in 1879. And that had never been looked at. And it was very easy to find. I mean, I found the reference for it online, but I had to go to the archives to look at it. But no one had consulted that. The file on his a murder he committed in a little town called Belvedere in northern Illinois. There's a huge file there in transcript, and I think it's hardly ever been looked at. So I really want to see everything I can about the case, but I do want to also understand myself the times and draw the reader into those times so they understand the kinds of context you were talking about.
I'm going to ask you one more question before we get into the reading, but I'm happy to tell you that there are questions coming in from the audience and on the Q&A function. And I want to encourage audience members to keep stacking them up because I will be using them. But Dean, my last question is, there have been previous books about Dr. Cream, as you yourself say, you're not the first. What is it new that you've brought to this story?
Well, I'd like to think this is as complete as I could make it. As I said, I unearthed a lot of new records. I'm not content to just search the newspaper archives on the internet, and those are valuable. But there are a lot of newspapers that are still only available in microfilm. So there were several days spent at the Chicago Library going through old school fashion, going through microfilm files. I think that looking at it as a detective story, again, you know who the quarry is, but understanding how this doctor is brought to justice is, I think, is different, and that's really how it struck me. You know, we have to make choices as writers. How are we going to tell the story? What's the best way? And of course, it's hard to know, and this may not be the best way, but I thought it was a way that really encouraged the reader to follow along, to learn his past as Scotland Yard learned, as I learned it, and now you're learning it as a reader.
Yes, and I really like the fact that, you know, Dr. Cream is front and center, but we learn about the detectives too. They become characters, and their sort of a personal approach and sort of what they do and how they go about the work. I actually found that absolutely fascinating. Dean, can I suggest that you now do your short reading, because we've set it up a bit for listeners and viewers, and now you can get a taste of just the drama in this story and the suspense. Carry on.
Well, this is obviously a story of a serial killer who gets away with as many as 10 murders by the time he's brought to justice. So I wanted to read tonight from when he met his match, a woman he tried to kill in London, but proved to be just a little too smart for him. So to set the scene, I'd like you to picture the London of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and perhaps are about to hail a hansom cab on a sinister fog-shrouded street. A woman in her mid-20s waited beneath the Gothic facade of St. James Hall on Regent Street, just off Piccadilly Circus. Neatly trimmed brows arched above her large, lively eyes, and brown hair framed her delicate face. Light from gas street lamps danced and glistened on the wet pavement, scrubbed clean by days of heavy rain. A man in a black overcoat, a top hat perched upon his bald head, touched her on the shoulder. A mustache softened his sharp features of his thin face, but what stood out were his eyes, steel gray and magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles. They were crossed. No one would have described the man as handsome, but the woman had spotted the glint of a gold watch. This was a man of means. She had met him earlier that October night in 1891 at the nearby Alhambra Theatre of Varieties, a massive hall complete with minarets that could pack more than 4,000 into its galleries, standing room sections, and bars. But many of the men in the audience were not there for the shows. Scantily clad dancers returned backstage to find notes from admirers in the box seats, some making what were politely called improper proposals. Prostitutes circled the crowd and scanned the seats. The theater's manager reckoned as many as 100 women of the town, as he called them, were in attendance on most nights. As long as they were well dressed and discreet, like the woman who had set up the rendezvous on Regent Street, their presence was tolerated. The woman and the man in the top hat walked a half dozen blocks to the Paris Hotel on Berwick Street in Soho, a seedy enclave on the edge of the West End Theatre District. He said he was a doctor at St. Thomas's across the river in Lambeth. This was not quite true. He was a medical man, but he had no affiliation with the hospital. What was her name? Lou Harvey, she said. It was short for Louisa. Thomas Neil Cream did not offer his name. She never asked. In the morning, he paid her £3, more than she usually made in a week. They arranged to meet again later that day, 7:30 on the Thames Embankment, near the Charing Cross Railroad Station. He would take her to a show, her choice. She picked the Oxford Music Hall on Tottenham Court Road, one of the best and most popular in the city. But as they parted, he made a strange remark. He said I had a few spots on my forehead, Harvey would recall. He said he would bring me some pills to take them away. He was waiting for her when she reached the riverside that evening. They walked to the nearby Northumberland Arms public house for a glass of wine. Then they strolled to the river's edge, lined with hissing gas lamps that cast an eerie glow over the embankment. He reached into a pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out 2 oblong, light-colored capsules. Don't bite them, he told her. Swallow them as they are. He pressed them into the palm of her right hand. She lifted her hand to her mouth and seemed to swallow the pills, but he wanted to be sure. Show me your hand, he said. She did. It was empty. He asked to see her left hand. It too was empty. Suddenly, he said, there was a change of plans. He had an appointment at the hospital, but she should go to the music hall on her own. He would meet her outside, and they would go back to the Paris Hotel for the night. He gave her 5 shillings for cab fare. Meet me at 11, Cream said as he turned and walked towards Westminster Bridge and in the direction of the hospital. Goodbye for the present. Harvey, wary of her generous new customer, had not taken the pills. Not liking the look of them, she would recall, I pretended to put them in my mouth. In the flickering gaslight, the doctor had not noticed as she passed them from hand to hand. When he looked away for a moment, she dropped them over the edge of the embankment. Hours later, At 11 o'clock, as arranged, Harvey emerged from the Oxford Music Hall. Cream was not there. She waited for half an hour, but he never showed up. Strange, she must have thought. It was as if he had never expected her to keep the appointment. Thanks.
Very eerie, the murderous Dr. Cream. It's a wonderful glimpse into that young woman too, who was smart enough to realize she shouldn't take pills from a stranger. But
That's right.
the way you set it up is so beautiful, that with her being smart enough to pass them from hand to hand.
And she will play a key role in what happens to him, as will some other women. And I thought that was a very interesting aspect of this story, that while Scotland Yard was making inroads, some of the most crucial evidence and breakthroughs are actually women who come forward and really push the case, push the allegations against him forward.
So Nadine, Alan and Debbie ask, what was the timeline from the first victim to the last? And did he choose his victims on the bases of probability of getting away with it, or because he felt they deserved it, or for some other reason?
Later, after he's arrested, a witness, someone he'd befriended in London, claimed that Cream said that the women he was killing were cattle and deserved to die. So that gives some sense of his attitude, at least by 1892. His first murder was 1877. His last was 1892, but he spent 10 years in prison. So the timeline really is about a half dozen years where he does all of these murders. And in terms of how he selected his victims, he did move from town to town when things got hot and when suspicion came in. There was no clear pattern to how he chose his victims. And I think that again is maybe an insight into this twisted psyche that he just could decide. There's evidence, a couple of people he offered pills to who prudently declined. And there were at least two other women who took pills he gave them and became sick, but recovered. It's never clear whether those were tainted as well, but I think given the whole picture, yeah. So whether those people were lucky or he toyed with them and gave them a non-lethal dose, we'll never know.
Well, Mike Madigan wonders whether Dr. Cream was overtly or overly religious in some weird way, and possibly he killed his victims because of religious ideals, particularly, if they were fallen women and therefore immoral.
Well, that's interesting. He did talk about as well. He talked about prostitutes as sort of a scourge to be eliminated. Whether it came out of religious background, very good question, Mike, because he was raised as a devout Presbyterian. He sang in the choir. In fact, even as an adult in London, Ontario, he was singing at church. And he was like a Jekyll and Hyde. In the day, he was respectable. In the night, he was known to drink and known for debauchery. And so, those two elements that were popularized in the Victorian era, the dichotomy between the upstanding man who has an inner evil hide, he really personified that. So there may have been sort of a religious element. Certainly that is one of the sort of surprising features, is that, even as a young man, he taught Sunday school. So he was a member of many churches.
I mean, how can a Sunday school teacher possibly murder people? Well, I think we're less naive than we used to be about the people's dark side.
Yeah.
Kim Pittaway asks a question I would love to have thought of too, which was, during your research, was there a particular aha moment when you found something unexpected or particularly exciting from the storytelling point of view?
Well, I'll never forget standing in the or being in the National Archives in London and going through the Scotland Yard file and finding letters. One of the things that Cream did is that partly one of the things that helped expose him is he wrote letters accusing other people of his crimes. They
Yes.
were blackmail letters, although he never collected money. It was just part of this madness that was all balled up in this fellow. There was speculation at the time that he had to tell someone, even though he wasn't putting his name to these letters. It was like he had to share his exploits. But anyway, these letters found them in the file, and it was quite a feeling to realize these were the real letters. These weren't facsimiles. These weren't photocopies. These were the actual letters, pasted on cardboard. So really, there are times when you're doing archival research where, you come face to face with the person. Same as cracking open the Register of Graduates of Medical School in 1876 in McGill, and there's Thomas Cream's signature. He handled this book. He signed this book. So those are always moments. All through it, lots of aha moments, though. Lots of times where I found things in his own words, something he might have mentioned in court, or new evidence or new accounts of testimony he gave in various times, either in archival records or newspapers. And all of those were, aha moments, because I knew from my knowledge of what had been written that this was new material that I wanted to use in the book.
Now, Laura Carter asks, when writing your books, is the historical research the place which you find most interesting, the piece you find most interesting, or are you considering diving into any modern crime stories next?
I thought the question was going to be, do you enjoy research more than writing? And I was going to say, Charlotte Gray once said, research is fun, writing is work. I do. I spent years covering the courts for the Halifax Herald. I've done a lot of contemporary crime, but my academic studies years ago was history, and I've just been always fascinated with the past. And I won't rule out a contemporary crime or a more modern, and I have written on crimes that relatively recent for me, 50 or 60 years ago. But I just find, as you said, Charlotte, they're just so instructive of the past. And I think once you do start in an era, I've now done the 1920s with Empire of Deception, and Victorian era here. Of course, in the course of your research, you see other stories, other news coverage on the page, or another account in an anthology. And so it does kind of keep you in a certain period.
There's also, I have to say, something absolutely fascinating about, contemporary true crime has the sort of urgency of the moment, but there isn't that extraordinary sense of looking through a telescope and knowing that you want to paint a much fuller picture for your readers, because they probably don't know what Halifax looked like in the mid 19th century, and they don't know sort of what life in a Chicago prison was like at the end of the 19th century. And whereas a modern true crime book always has much less contextual detail, so it's sort of much more sort of linear, straight for the punch than what we can do when we're doing a historical true crime.
But of course, there's the advantage of being able to ask like all the questions. What was going on in Cream's head? What were people thinking? How did this policeman or that coroner miss these facts? Well, you can ask. Or, in real time, they may be under the gun at an inquiry or something. So you do lose that ability to, you can only question documents so far. They don't tend to give up more than what's written on them.
Bernard Wood, like me, grew up in Britain, and he asks, in Britain, I remember Dr. Crippen being the archetype for the medical serial killer. Now, Dr. Cream, though, predated Crippen by a couple of decades. So how is he so much less known?
Well, Bernard, it's hard to say. you know what, when I decided to embark on this journey, I knew about him. He was on the you know, he was out there as a potential subject and interesting. He was such a sensation in his time, but he has been forgotten. And you know, as you know, Charlotte, it's amazing as you start digging back. You do find these figures that were a sensation in their time, and then over time, interestingly, George Orwell, the great writer, when he was writing about the allure of the English murder, he mentioned Cream as one of the figures whose names would, you know, never be forgotten, and it's kind of ironic that he largely was. But so hopefully that's about to change.
We have so many questions, and I know we haven't got time for them all. But one of the questions is, did Dr. Cream, and this is from John Graham Reed, did Dr. Cream enjoy being hunted by detectives, you know, matching wits and perhaps demonstrating his intellectual superiority to Scotland Yard?
Excellent question, because not only was he running around talking to people about these murders and betraying quite a bit of knowledge of what had happened, he was doing this with detectives he befriended. He drank with them in pubs. He delighted in that world, and you know, risky behavior for a murderer. But yes, he posed as a detective in some of the blackmail letters he wrote. He did seem to really enjoy that, enjoy the idea of being more knowledgeable. And I mean, I don't think he got to the point where he was, you know, actively leaving clues. But you know, for a serial killer to befriend the people that are hunting the serial killer, yeah, it does speak of some kind of deep down interest or toying with the detectives.
Did any other local doctors or medical professionals become suspicious of his activities? Bev Boyd asks, was it whether it was offering abortions or procuring ingredients for poison? Surely others must have got suspicious. The pharmacists.
A lot of doctors testified against him, either ones that examined patients or a McGill classmate who was practicing medicine in Chicago ended up accused of one of his crimes by Cream. So he didn't make a lot of friends in the medical fraternity, but doctors were like patients. They found it hard to believe that one of their own would kill. And a medical journal at the time had an article about doctors who kill, because there were others in the Victorian era, and saying how, I remember the line, it was how difficult it was to believe a brother physician, you know, could be capable of something like this. So many doctors testified against him, and you know, did have their suspicions and actual evidence that was brought forward.
Now, several people have asked, how long did it take to write the book, from sort of starting the research to today?
I started on the in late 2016. The book was finished about a year ago, and that timing issues, pandemic, and things like that meant that was time. So about 4 years, 4.5 years.
That's and I guess you had a few other things to do in your day.
Well, yes, that's true. It's not, yeah, that's working it in around other duties.
So Joel Hunter asks, how often do you investigate a story and then decide not to write about it? And how do you decide which book you will write?
That's an excellent question. I mean, it also becomes a matter of negotiation with a publisher who's interested in it. I also do smaller stories, chapters in books, or shorter feature type stories. So I sometimes will say, wow, that looked kind of promising. it's not really, it's not, there's not a lot there, but it'll make an interesting feature. So you can kind of, recycle your research. But it is difficult because you can get very passionate and very interested in the research. But, does it have that bigger story? Cream had that window on the Victorian era. It had that the detection and the flaws in detection and the development of early forensics. It had all of that going for it. And it is a challenge, Joel, to find a story that really has, I guess, one of a better word, legs, that has that extra angle. Either, for instance, if it weren't for all of the Scotland Yard records, there wouldn't be the ability to tell the story as a hunt. It would be a very different book, and it's very common to run into that and say, this is an interesting story, but there are no diaries, there are no memoirs. And of course, you want to tell as much as you can in the voice of the people involved. So you want to try to find that too.
You have the letters that the blackmail letters he wrote, but he never kept a diary, or you don't have any personal letters that he wrote.
No, lots of letters about him, because when he was able to possibly, and I think probably, bribed his way out of prison in 1891, he had a huge stack of testimonial letters from people who knew him in Quebec City, and didn't understand how he'd ended up convicted of murder, but attested to him. So that gave me insights. And every once in a while, as I say, somewhere in the records, I'd hear his voice. I would be able to, I'd say, okay, now I can, and I'll just say one humorous thing. He was accused of all things of sending obscene postcards in the mail to harass one of his neighbors. And when he was charged with this and brought before the judge, he said he didn't know why it was such a big deal. He said, people in Canada do this all the time. And I had to laugh when I thought, well, I don't know if that flew in Chicago, but I don't remember that being anything that I recall back in Canada. But so I thought, okay, there's a line that's going in the book.
That it's pretty irresistible. It's not the image of Canadians today or yesterday that we instantly expect. So Mike would like to know, do you have a set time for writing, like 5 a.m., or do you write when the mood strikes?
Well, 20 years in the newsroom, and some of them spent with clacking typewriters back in the day, means I can write anywhere. But I tend to write, I don't know what your practice is. I tend to be an early riser, and that's when I write. Deadlines mean I may be writing later in the day than I wish I did, but I find that my most productive time. And I find it, you're rested, your mind's sharper, and I find the break between, say, reading through the day or before bed, suddenly it all starts to gel and makes it easier to write in the morning. I'd be curious, Charlotte, what are your preferred hours?
They keep shifting a little, but I'm much more productive in the morning. Yeah. And I used to write a lot in the very early morning when my kids were living at home. I'd write before they woke up. But now morning is the best. Dean, you have been so interesting to speak to. We have more questions, which I do apologize to everybody that we just don't have time for them all, because I can see that you've really fired people's imagination. Either you have fired their imagination, or the Murderous Dr. Cream has fired their imagination. He is a fascinating character in your hands. It's a fantastic book. Many, many congratulations. So I'm going to hand back to Mike here. I hope his face will appear. Hi, Mike. We've had a conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it.
That was a tremendous conversation. And thank you, Charlotte, for being such a capable and engaging moderator in the conversation. It was truly, truly enjoyable. And thank you for taking your time. And before I thank Dean, I'd like to thank once again all the attendees who are here. And once again, we'll be drawing a name at random from all the people who have asked a question, and you will receive, we'll get it to you, a free copy of Dr. Cream. Dean, I think come award season, your book will be in the nomination list once again. And as a bookseller, from a bookseller's heart, I will say that your book is going to be one of our bestsellers this year. So thank you once again for writing the book and for agreeing to do this. It's been a wonderful evening, and thank you.
Well, I'd like to take a moment to thank first the forbearance of everyone who came in and wondered where we were, and I'm glad we got that sorted out. I thought maybe Dr. Cream was trying to do his spirit was trying to do a block or something. I'd like to thank Charlotte so much for, I'm such an admirer of your work, for agreeing to do this. Bookmark, you're such a wonderful store and so supportive for hosting this. And Harper Collins for their support of the project, and really all of you, because ultimately, you know, it's the readers who decide what's good, and we hope that, you know, our books will go out in the world, and our words will be read, and so thank you for your interest, and thanks for coming tonight.
And I'll just close off by saying that anybody who registered with us by email will get a link to the recorded version of this evening. And once again, thank you, everybody. It's been an honor for us, and I hope everybody's enjoyed this evening. And thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.